Robert Welsh, who founded the John Birch Society in December 1958, warned about the power and influence of a worldwide master conspiracy at every opportunity. In September 1972, his warning included this short summary. This plan is to establish very soon the first stages of a new world order. This will be the novus ordo seclorum for which a self-perpetuating inner circle of conspirators has been working and scheming relentlessly during some 6 generations. In the fall of 1990, shortly after President Bush sent several 100,000 U.S. troops into the Middle East to counter Iraq's seizure of Kuwait, he began to use the phrase New World Order when referring to his Constitution-skirting actions. For example, on September 11, 1990, he stated, "Out of these troubled times, our 5th objective, a new world order, can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders." He would repeat his call for a new world order many more times. Each time he did so, he made it clear that the goal he sought would be attained through rebuilding, restoring, or reinvigorating the United Nations. By August 1991, the Bush administration issued a document entitled National Security Strategy of the United States. An introduction signed by the President himself stated, "In the Gulf, we saw the United Nations playing the role dreamed of by its founders. I hope history will record that the Gulf crisis was the crucible of the New World Order." Mr. Bush's stated objective in committing our troops to the war that became known as Desert Storm was to help the United Nations become more important, to give it the boost it needed so that it could perform in the manner envisioned by its founders. Those founders included a U.S. delegation led by a secret communist named Alger Hiss and 15 others later named by congressional investigating bodies as members of the U.S. Communist Party. Also, Robert W. Lee noted in his 1981 book, The United Nations Conspiracy, that 43 members of the U.S. delegation to the 1945 UN Founding Conference were members of the World Government Promoting Council on Foreign Relations. And that was the bulk of the U.S. delegation. The Soviet Union was represented at the UN's founding conference by a contingent of hardcore communists led by Andrei Gromyko. Other nations sent their one-worlders, socialists, communists, and utopian dreamers. Advocates of national sovereignty weren't welcome. The goal of all these founders was clear. They wanted world government. The New World Order was to be built around 2 main pillars: world government and economic control through some form of socialism. The conspirators would be satisfied with either communist-imposed socialism or socialism brought about by the slower, more scheming technique of having a people vote themselves into tyranny. Once imposed worldwide, however, economic control would be maintained by the same brutal force that victims of communism have always experienced. George Bush never defined the term he so frequently uttered. Reporters who sought to find out exactly what he meant by it were completely unsuccessful. Here is one article dated February 24, 1991, which was after the fighting had ended in Iraq. While this reporter never got the answer he sought, he was told by a White House spokesman the following utter nonsense. One August morning in Kennebunkport, Maine, Bush took his national security advisor, Brent Scowcroft, for a ride on the presidential speedboat, Fidelity. 4 hours later, the president came ashore with a ringing slogan that Scowcroft had offered, "The New World Order." A phrase coined by Brent Scowcroft in 1990? How then explain the 1940 book entitled The New World Order, written by British socialist H.G. Wells? Or the speech given by New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller in 1968, where he called for a new world order? Or President Richard Nixon's 1972 toast to the bloody-handed Chu Enlai in China about the hope that each of us has to build a new world order? Or Fidel Castro's 1979 speech to the United Nations, where he demanded a new world order? Or Mikhail Gorbachev's 1990 speech 2 months before George Bush's boat ride off the Maine coast, in which the Soviet Union's president also called for a new world order? Simply stated, the phrase New World Order, meaning a worldwide tyranny built around socialism and world government, has been the slogan of the conspiracy for well over 200 years. Some who use it obviously don't understand either its full meaning or its history, but they are perfectly willing to carry out whatever steps are needed to bring it about. On the other hand, others are fully cognizant of the meaning and support the continuous usage of the phrase over many years. They employ the term New World Order very much like a secret handshake to indicate to others that they are the willing servants of an evil conspiracy. Any war, George Bush's war against Iraq included, does indeed bring about more government. And it also spawns moral decline, which makes it easier to lead a people into tyranny. And some wars are deliberately arranged in order to effect these very consequences. In 1953 and 54, Congressman Carroll Reese of Tennessee led a special House committee formed to investigate the large tax-exempt foundations that had been financing subversion within our nation. He hired a man named Norman Dodd to be the committee's top researcher. Dodd sent a committee staffer named Catherine Casey to examine the records of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the wealthy foundations known to be involved in financing subversive activity. The results of the Reese Committee's investigations are recounted in William McElhenney's 1980 book, The Tax-Exempt Foundations. Miss Casey, a lawyer, spent several days in New York and returned to Washington somewhat dazed by what she had found. She reported that the Carnegie minutes for 1911 told of the trustees raising the question, quote, "Is there any means known to man more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people?" End quote. At the end of a year, according to the minutes, the trustees concluded that there was no more effective way to accomplish that goal other than war. So then they raised another question. How do we involve the United States in a war? When this discussion was being held by the Carnegie trustees, the United States had completely severed all but diplomatic ties to Europe. Our country had become totally independent and a rapidly growing nation of religiously based people who wanted most of all to be left alone to work out their own destiny. But unbeknownst to them, powerful individuals were busily plotting to alter their entire life by pushing the nation into a war that would indeed produce moral decline, more government, and the beginning of a drive for world government. Our nation did go to war in 1917, and out of World War I came the first attempt at world government, the League of Nations. In 1919, when the U.S. Senate refused to have our nation become a part of the League, its advocates formed the Council on Foreign Relations for the purpose of making sure that a future try at world government would be approved. They went to work gathering into the CFR's ranks the movers and shakers of our nation who would then use their influence to promote world government. Today, that very same Council on Foreign Relations can claim as members 5 of the past 6 U.S. presidents, including Bill Clinton, the current top leaders of the Congress, and several members of the U.S. Supreme Court. As of September 1996, the total membership of this elite organization numbers only 3,329, yet 513 of those members are U.S. government officials. In addition to the heavy presence of CFR members in government, the organization also has amongst its members the top leaders in the mass media, foundations, international corporations, the academic world, and the military. For most of the 20th century, many members of the CFR have done all they could to implement the plans of a powerful conspiracy determined to rule the world. National sovereignty and economic freedom mean nothing to these individuals. They are instead anxious to build power for themselves, even as they build the conspiracy's New World Order. Much has been written about the history and accomplishments of this elite New York-based organization. Books such as James Perloff's The Shadows of Power and my own, The Insiders, have helped to spread needed information about the Council on Foreign Relations and its stepchild, the Trilateral Commission. In 1966, Professor Carroll Quigley bared many details about the founding and goal of the CFR in his book, Tragedy and Hope. A Georgetown University scholar who was Bill Clinton's instructor during the future president's undergraduate days, Quigley revealed that a secret society determined to rule the world created the CFR for that very purpose. An elitist himself, he published his findings not as an opponent, but as an admirer of the entire undertaking. He never labeled the CFR or its antecedents a conspiracy because he didn't consider it to be evil. In another of his revealing books, The Anglo-American Establishment, Quigley bared details about the secret society's creation and funding of the Rhodes Scholar Program. Referring to Cecil Rhodes, one of the key participants in the plot he was describing, Quigley wrote, "The Rhodes Scholarships were merely a facade to conceal the secret society, or, more accurately, they were to be one of the instruments by which the secret society could carry out his purposes." It should come as little surprise, therefore, to find that Bill Clinton is only one of many prominent Americans who was a Rhodes Scholar and has, for many years, been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It is impossible to overstate the importance of the secret society origin of these undertakings. Reese Committee staffer Catherine Casey also reported finding in the Carnegie Minutes that the trustees exulted over the entry of our nation into World War I. She discovered that the trustees even sent a telegram to President Wilson cautioning him to see that the war did not end too soon. In keeping with the Illuminati's modus operandi, no scruple, not even the deaths associated with a world war, was to interfere with the designs of the conspiracy. Throughout its history, the conspiracy has worked to foment wars. U.S. involvement in World War I resulted in part from anger over Germany's sinking of the British vessel Lusitania. That attack killed 1,200 innocent civilians, many of whom were Americans. Germany and England were already at war, and the Lusitania's hold, unbeknownst to the passengers who thought they were aboard a pleasure vessel, was full of military supplies. But as is conclusively shown in this 1972 book, the ship was carrying munitions, was an armed auxiliary cruiser of the British Navy, and the German government had warned civilians not to travel aboard it. Yet British authorities steered it towards German submarines. World War II began for our nation when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Yet the evidence that President Roosevelt and his top advisors knew of the Japanese plans and refused to alert our forces in Hawaii is overwhelming. World government advocates, still angry over our nation's refusal to join the League of Nations, wanted another, even more horrible war in order to generate support for another try at world government, the United Nations. Where the Carnegie trustees in 1918 had urged President Wilson not to end World War I too soon, President Roosevelt extended World War II by refusing to accept a Japanese peace proposal in January 1945. A detailed 40-page peace offer was given General Douglas MacArthur 7 full months prior to Japan being allowed to surrender. He forwarded it immediately to President Roosevelt, who ignored it. It contained the exact conditions of surrender accepted 7 months later. This front-page article from the August 19, 1945 Chicago Tribune documents the facts surrounding the Japanese surrender proposal and the refusal of our nation's leaders to accept it. Had the Japanese peace offer been accepted when first given, there would have been no costly battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and there would have been no use of the atomic bomb against the Japanese population. The detonating of the atomic bomb, of course, spurred many to believe that a world government was the only remaining recourse. U.S. leaders then sent American forces into Korea in 1950, but under UN command in an undeclared war. Those forces were denied a victory they could have won. Other U.S. leaders sent millions more American troops into Vietnam in the 1960s in another undeclared war, which also clearly violated the U.S. Constitution. In Vietnam, our troops served as part of a UN regional arrangement known as the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. They, too, were forced to fight with incredible restrictions that invited defeat and the takeover of several nations by brutal communist forces. Then came the war against Iraq, whose openly expressed purpose was to build a new world order and a reinvigorated United Nations. Our nation was already groaning under too much government, and now war would be used to empower a world government. The overall plan of the Illuminati and all its successor organizations was to infiltrate and control the key areas of human conduct. These would include education, religion, the informing of the people, and the government. We shall focus on each of these areas in turn, beginning with the conspiracy's efforts in the field of education. When Catherine Casey of the Reese Committee pored over the minutes of the Carnegie trustees, she read of their plans to take control of American education to assure that the nation did not revert to the kind of life it had been enjoying prior to the war. The Carnegie trustees approached counterparts at other foundations and received their agreement to spend some of their enormous resources to steer the nation's educational system down a globalist and socialist path. Counterparts at the Rockefeller Foundation agreed to work for control of that portion of American education dealing with domestic subjects. The Carnegie trustees then approached prominent historians, seeking their willingness to alter the teaching of American history. While they met with some refusals, they secured the help of the Guggenheim Foundation to grant scholarships to selected candidates for advanced degrees in history who would carry out their designs. Hardly any Americans knew what these conspirators were planning, and the overall purpose of this activity was to alter the self-reliance and independent spirit of the people of this nation so that their resistance to a world government could be broken. In his important 1981 book, Is Public Education Necessary?, Samuel L. Blumenfeld pointed out that government-run education in America was never needed. The literacy rate in our nation was greater before the advent of public schools and compulsory education. Socialists and others promoted the public school movement through secret organizations as far back as 1829, and the basis upon which American education was built and flourished, strong emphasis on religion and morality, has effectively been cast aside. As Blumenfeld reported, several church groups in Massachusetts in the early 19th century worked for the creation of a state-run education system they wanted to control. The leaders of these religions hoped to use the government system to propagate their beliefs. Later on, socialist Robert Dale Owen formed a secret society working for a compulsory government system that would spread his beliefs. These various factions eventually united behind Horace Mann, who, we are told today, should be revered as the father of American public education. Blumenfeld says instead, quote, "If Horace Mann was the father of anything, it was of centralized, state-controlled public education governed by a state bureaucracy and financed by taxes on property," end quote. The key element in all of this was a desire on the part of several groups to use the force of government to propagate their views. Some were religious in nature, others had political goals, but they all wanted to force their views in the schools. So they had to have a government-run school system first. In his book, Blumenfeld noted that Horace Mann happily accepted the support of anyone in changing American education from its free market course to an irreversible statist one. And Blumenfeld documented the revealing fact that Mann and his followers chose for their model the authoritarian Prussian system, where parental influence was replaced by state domination over children. By the 1830s, Unitarian minister Orestes Brownson had become one of the leaders of the movement to establish compulsory state-run education in Massachusetts. He later converted to Catholicism, abandoned his interest in compulsory education, and ended up teaching at Notre Dame University. In his autobiography, Brownson wrote of the goal he initially sought. The great object was to get rid of Christianity. For this purpose, a secret society was formed, and the whole country was to be organized on the plan of the Carbonari of Italy. Here we see the same conspiratorial organizations influencing the creation of our nation's compulsory school system. That it has degenerated to what can be found today should come as no surprise. In 1981, when this book was written, Blumenfeld summarized the American educational scene. While it is true that there are many good teachers in some public schools who are able to help students in spite of the system, Blumenfeld stated, "Today, most of the young adults who emerge from the process read poorly, write miserably, have stunted vocabularies, cannot do arithmetic well, know little geography and less history, and know virtually nothing about the economic system in which they live. At school, they fall under strong peer pressure, are introduced to drugs and sexual promiscuity, while their teachers preach the moral relativism of secular humanism as a substitute for the outmoded moral codes of religion. Only 2 years later, in 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education issued a report entitled A Nation at Risk. Its shocking conclusion stated, "The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and as a people. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war." As stark a reality as that statement indicates, it does not take note of the fact that much of the instruction, even in such subjects as history, civics, and economics, has become counterproductive, since much of what is taught is simply not so. Government-run education in America isn't mediocre, it's subversive. One major promoter of these developments is the nation's most powerful labor union, the National Education Association. In another of Blumenfeld's valuable works, his 1984 book, NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education, he traced the history of the NEA from its creation in 1857, when it was known as the National Teachers Association. Today he claims that, quote, "For all practical purposes, the NEA might as well be the Socialist Party in America," end quote. Forming coalitions with other labor unions and gaining tremendous influence over the political parties and numerous elected officials, the 2.2 million member NEA has in recent years backed Marxist revolution in Central America, waged incessant war against conservative principles, and stepped up its attack on capitalism and its promotion of socialism. Uncompromisingly atheistic, the NEA has for years advocated amoral sex education, abortion on demand, gun control, environmental extremism, nuclear disarmament, acceptance of the homosexual lifestyle, and socialized medicine. What the NEA objects to is also revealing. It opposes encouraging students to restrict sexual intercourse to heterosexual marriage, wants no one to be permitted to homeschool his or her own children unless properly licensed and forced to follow a state-approved curriculum, and objects to testing teachers for drugs, alcohol, or AIDS. To sum up, as detailed in this comprehensive 1994 survey of education published in this special issue of the New American Magazine, America's government-run education system has been transformed into an enemy of this nation. And with so many families finding it necessary for both spouses to work outside the home, one to provide for the family's needs and the other to meet ever larger tax bills, the influence of parents over their children has declined and the influence of the schools has grown. In 30 states, public school teachers are required to become members of a state affiliate of the NEA, effectively amounting to membership in the NEA itself. No American should be required to belong to any union in order to work, and no one should be forced by law to pay for any educational system, good or bad. If education and its funding were voluntary, its quality would soar and our nation would not suffer from an increasingly ill-informed populace. Conspirators know that poorly educated people are far more easily controlled. The answer is to let those who want religious training in the schools have their schools. Let those who don't want it have theirs, and don't force anyone to finance someone else's idea of education. Should the truly American way of dealing with education be adopted, two very important developments would follow. One, the huge amounts of money left in the hands of the people would spawn the immediate creation of private schools and academies. And two, deserving and eager students whose families could not afford to send them to the new privately run schools would be the beneficiaries of scholarships and grants. This, too, has always been the American way. Adam Weishaupt would be thrilled to witness what America's educational system has become, but he would also be delighted at the condition of religion in America and the rest of the world. The departure from the prevailing religious base at the time this nation was born can largely be traced to two men, influential theologian Dr. Walter Rauschenbusch and seminary leader Dr. Harry Ward. A socialist first and theologian second, Rauschenbusch stated in 1893 that, quote, the only power that can make socialism succeed is religion, end quote. In 1907, he journeyed to England to consult with the founders of England's Fabian Socialist Society, Beatrice and Sidney Webb. Over several decades, he had a profound influence in turning America's mainline Protestant religions into conduits of the social gospel. Late in his life, Reverend Harry Ward was identified as a communist by Benjamin Gitlow, the first leader of the Communist Party USA, and by Manning Johnson, at one point the leader of the party's Negro section. Reverend Ward's subversive career began in 1908 when he founded the Methodist Federation for Social Action, the oldest officially cited Communist Front organization in America. In 1909, he helped to found the Federal Council of Churches, an organization grouping most of the Protestant religions in America under one umbrella. For more than 25 years, Ward indoctrinated many hundreds of seminary students with his leftist and pro-communist views at New York's Union Theological Seminary. By 1935, the Office of Naval Intelligence issued a report identifying the Federal Council of Churches as one of several organizations which, quote, give aid and comfort to the communist movement and party, end quote. Similar condemnations were being issued by other private and official groups. In 1937, the religious magazine Religion in Life carried articles by a soon-to-be famous American who was an official of the Federal Council of Churches. Of various problems facing mankind, this man wrote, "A theoretical solution lies in the abolition of the entire concept of national sovereignty and the unification of the world into a single nation. Before us today, we have the spectacle of communism and fascism, changing almost overnight the characteristics of entire peoples. Millions of individuals have been made into different and, on the whole, finer people." Who is this man who called for abolition of national sovereignty and who praised communism and fascism? He is John Foster Dulles, a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of several of the commissions organized by the Federal Council of Churches, a member of the U.S. delegation to the San Francisco Conference, where the United Nations was created, and our nation's Secretary of State during the Eisenhower administration. As a prominent churchman and an even more prominent diplomat, Dulles spent his entire adult life seeking to undo the United States of America. The Dulles career is capably surveyed in The Actor, The True Story of John Foster Dulles by Alan Stang. As the book's title indicates, Dulles spent his later years acting the part of a sovereignty-defending diplomat while working for the world government he had committed to as a young man. By the 1940s, the smell of totalitarian advocacy coming out of the Federal Council of Churches could no longer be denied. So the FCC leaders simply changed the name of the organization to the National Council of Churches. The switch was accomplished at a meeting held in Cleveland in 1950. The December 1950 bulletin issued by the Federal Council of Churches announced the name change while making it clear that, quote, all the work of the Federal Council will continue under the new auspices, end quote. Continue it did. In 1960, Richard Aarons, the staff director of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, stated to the full committee, thus far of the leadership of the National Council of Churches of Christ in America, we have found over 100 persons in leadership capacity with either Communist Front records or records of service to the communist causes. Churches and churchgoers still affiliated with the National Council of Churches should know that this organization has no better leadership today. And the same can be said of the World Council of Churches, to which many of these same churches also belong. But what of the Catholic Church that has never formally affiliated with either the Federal Council, the National Council, or the World Council of Churches? Adam Weishaupt made very plain his goal of destroying the Catholic Church. Did he or his successors make any progress toward this goal? In 18th century France, revolutionaries spurred on by conspirators attacked the Catholic clergy, killed many of its priests and nuns, and closed churches everywhere. Fully 20,000 members of the Catholic clergy fled to Britain, where they were given a sanctuary during the bloody French Revolution. Weishaupt's designs were convincingly carried out in France. We have previously mentioned the plans of the Italian branch of the conspiracy, the Carbonari, to infiltrate the Catholic Church. The mid-19th century goal of the Alta Vendita, the highest lodge of the Carbonari, was to have the Catholic people follow the direction of the conspirators it sent into the seminaries. The eventual goal of the Carbonari, explicitly stated in the permanent instructions of its Alta Vendita, was to seek a pope according to our wants. In the early 1960s, during Vatican II Council, a mere 450 of the Council's 2,150 participants petitioned to have the entire Council reissue a condemnation of communism. This small number, despite the clear record of the preceding 20 years, when communist-led governments had killed, tortured, and jailed thousands of Catholic priests in Europe and China. And the killing and jailing was still going on. The labeling of communism by Pope Pius XI as intrinsically evil in 1937 was essentially repudiated. Even worse, it was later learned that other church leaders had secretly arranged to cancel the church's once hardline attitude toward communism. Opponents of communism within the church didn't know that some of their officials had worked out an agreement with leaders of the Kremlin in 1962. The details of this remarkable arrangement, whereby the church agreed to cease condemning communism, were published in the New American Magazine in December 1985. In the United States, in early 1983, Joseph Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago and Father J. Brian Hare, a priest from Boston who was an official of the U.S. Catholic Conference in Washington, met in the nation's capital with selected members of the Council on Foreign Relations. In that meeting, the two Catholic clergymen thanked the CFR members for their assistance in formulating a position for the Church on the matter of possible use of nuclear arms by the U.S. to defend against any Soviet attack. The position they had formulated, a thinly disguised form of pacifism, was both un-American and un-Catholic. Father Hare, who had been a student at Harvard University of Professors Henry Kissinger and Stanley Hoffman, both veteran CFR members, would himself become a CFR member in 1975. A few years after meeting with the CFR leaders in Washington, Cardinal Bernardine was also welcomed into the membership ranks of the world government promoters at the Council on Foreign Relations. Another nationally known Catholic clergyman is Father Theodore Hesburgh of Notre Dame University. A member of the CFR since 1972, he has served on its board of directors and as the chairman of its membership committee. He has also served as chairman of the abortion funding Rockefeller Foundation and as a member of the board of the stridently secular and anti-religious People for the American Way. He has characterized pro-life advocates as mindless and crude zealots. In 1973, Hesburgh condemned national sovereignty as, quote, the one great remaining divider of humankind, end quote. As this newspaper headline shows, he proposed world citizenship. In 1991, he stated that a real new world order must include a commitment of 25,000 troops from each of 20 nations to be available for use by a newly restructured UN Security Council. These troops, said Hesburgh, would be employed as enforcers of peace wherever world problems developed. As horrifying as are all of these views of one of America's most prominent Catholic clergymen, it is even more horrifying to realize that no one in the hierarchy of the Church spoke out to oppose his subversive stands. One does not have to be a Catholic today to know that over the past 30 years, the Church has undergone a wholesale revision of its attitudes, its liturgy, and its disciplines. All throughout Latin America and even into southwestern United States, a new interpretation of Scripture based on Marxism and labeled liberation theology has been introduced by revolutionaries within the Catholic clergy. The consequences, both politically and religiously, have been devastating. The Catholic Church, that was always known by friend or foe as a bastion of traditional values, has become fragmented and disoriented. Into the vacuum created by religions that have lost their way has come New Age mysticism and pantheism. These new trends have found a very welcome home in the United Nations. For many years, Robert Mueller served as an Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations. He is one of many who have worked zealously to create a UN-directed New World religion. Mueller is not alone. much of the proceedings at the UN Conference on Environment and Development held in 1992 in Brazil centered around the need for a new universal faith based on the worship of nature, even of the earth itself. Among the enthusiastic supporters of this new UN-style religion can be found UN Assistant Secretary General Maurice Strong, Vice President Al Gore, and former Soviet dictator Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1995, plans for the formal establishment of an institution known as United Religions were laid at a meeting in San Francisco's Grace Episcopal Cathedral. The gathering was deliberately staged in San Francisco in 1995 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations in that city. Representatives of virtually all religions were present, along with some of the world's political and spiritual luminaries, such as Britain's Princess Margaret, South Africa's Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Lech Walesa of Poland, and then UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali. Plans were announced at this gathering to create a charter for this new United Religions organization by June 1997. It is to be patterned after the United Nations, with a General Assembly, a Security Council, and a Secretary General. Headquarters for the group are to be established by the year 2000 at the Presidio, a former U.S. military installation in San Francisco. The prime mover in this interfaith religiosity, where all who gather deny their beliefs in the name of world peace and unity, is Bishop William Swing of the Episcopal Diocese of California. His partners in the effort include the Gorbachev Foundation, which is also located at the Presidio, and the World Conference on Religion and Peace. Robert Mueller, who has offered his belief that Christ will find the answer to his dreams at the United Nations, has labored diligently to unite the world's religions ever since being steered to do so by UN Secretary General U Thant. He has stated that the inflexible belief systems of religious fundamentalism, quote, play an incendiary role in global conflicts, end quote. Referring to fundamentalist believers in any faith, he added, peace will be impossible without the taming of fundamentalism through a united religions that professes faithfulness only to the global spirituality and to the health of this planet. Just imagine a united religions doing for religion what a United Nations has been working for decades to do to nations. Weishaupt sought to gain control of the schools and the churches in order to influence what he called the common people. His goal has not been fully realized, but progress toward it has indeed been frightening. If he were alive today, he would seek control of the mass media in order to spread the conspiracy's influence. Though he himself is long in his grave, his conspiratorial descendants have certainly not overlooked the mass media. No discussion of our nation's mass media can ignore the impact of the Council on Foreign Relations. Its chief founder, the mysterious Edward Mandell House, President Woodrow Wilson's top advisor, has claimed in his writings that he wanted to establish, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, end quote. Most Americans know little or nothing about this organization, its influence within America's important institutions, and its effort to steer our nation into the New World Order. And a primary reason why the American people are unaware of the CFR's role is the organization's domination of all elements of the mass media. This recent issue of the New American Magazine contains several displays listing the government agencies, foundations, corporations, and mass media outlets that are led by CFR members. CFR members sit atop ABC, CBS, CNN, and NBC. They can be found in leadership positions at the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, and numerous other newspapers. CFR-led magazines include Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, National Review, Fortune, Forbes, and others. Numerous syndicated columnists whose work appears in newspapers all across the nation have also affiliated with the CFR. Therefore, we can say with certainty that most of the mass media's bases are covered by the CFR. The result is that the American people who rely on their radio, television, newspapers, and magazines are not being provided with the information they need and want. And they certainly are not being informed about the CFR. There is no doubt that communism has always been an arm of the conspiracy we have been describing. But when anyone in America tried to sound an alarm about the communist penetration of government and other institutions, it was he who became targeted. Such was the tactic of the Illuminati, whose response to anyone who might expose its members or its goals was, according to Professor Robeson, quote, to decry him, end quote. As the leader of the House Committee on Un-American Activities in the late 1930s, Congressman Martin Dies of Texas compiled lists containing the names of thousands of party members and sympathizers. He took the information to his fellow Democrat, President Franklin Roosevelt, but was angrily told by the president, quote, "There is nothing wrong with communists in this country. Some of the best friends I have are communists," end quote. Dies did what he could to impede the communist infiltration of our government. But in 1944, when he learned that he was facing a purge initiated by the president, he withdrew his candidacy for re-election and never served in the Congress again. Former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover told a Senate investigating committee that, quote, from November 8, 1945 until June 24, 1946, 7 communications went to the White House bearing on espionage activities wherein Harry Dexter White's name was specifically mentioned, end quote. White, the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, was then named by the Truman administration to the more influential post of Executive Secretary of the International Monetary Fund. With Illuminati-style justice, Hoover's name continues to be dragged through the mud many years after his death. As far back as 1939, the FBI issued numerous reports detailing the communist activity of Alger Hiss. Nevertheless, Hiss rose to even higher posts in the State Department and was the acting Secretary General of the UN Founding Conference in 1945. When he was exposed as a communist agent by former communist Whittaker Chambers, Chambers himself received the tar brush. The treatment accorded Senator Joseph McCarthy supplies even greater evidence of the conspiracy's ability to decry its adversaries. Contrary to widespread belief, McCarthy never harmed the good name of any innocent person. The truth about the Wisconsin senator is that he publicly named less than 200 individuals as security risks. His efforts produced no deaths, injuries, tortures, arrest without warrant, imprisonment without trial, deportations, or denials of due process. And all of those he named were indeed connected to communism. The crisis for Joe McCarthy came when he shifted his investigation from the Communist Party to high government officials who were protecting party members and impeding his legitimate work as a U.S. Senator. In 1954, McCarthy learned that a high-level meeting to formulate plans to deal with McCarthy had been held in the office of Attorney General Herbert Brownell. Attendees included top presidential advisor Sherman Adams, Ambassador to the UN Henry Cabot Lodge, Army Secretary John Adams, and according to the New York Times, top White House, defense, and justice officials. When McCarthy sought to find out the details of the meeting, his efforts were blocked by an order from President Eisenhower forbidding executive branch employees to supply information about the Get McCarthy meeting. As can be seen in this front page of the New York Times for May 18, 1954, the second headline reads, McCarthy hearing off a week as Eisenhower bars report. From that day forward, all congressional investigations of the executive branch were stymied. The Eisenhower order gave rise to the stonewalling practice known as executive privilege. This order effectively destroyed one of the carefully crafted checks and balances provided in the Constitution. That Congress allowed it then and continues to allow it today is evidence of the conspiracy's power. The senators who disapproved of McCarthy's campaign against communists infiltrating our government then went after McCarthy. He was eventually condemned formally on 2 completely ludicrous charges. The first was for not appearing before a Senate subcommittee after being invited to do so. Never had anyone been disciplined for failing to accept a mere invitation. But even more incredibly, the invitation never reached McCarthy until several days after the date of the suggested appearance. He was on a hunting trip in a remote part of northern Wisconsin, and the issuing senators knew it. The second count claimed that McCarthy had impaired the dignity of the United States Senate by describing the proceedings against him as a lynch party, which was a very good term for what was being done. For these 2 ostensible reasons, McCarthy's reputation was destroyed. His name became a symbol of unfair practices he never employed. Investigations bearing on subversives within the government were halted, and most of the communists and communist sympathizers whom he sought to remove from government either never left or were welcomed back into government service. Of course, the real reason why McCarthy had to be stopped was that he was getting too close to revealing the secret power behind communism in this nation. In all, 67 senators voted to condemn McCarthy on those two trumped-up charges, and only 22 stood by him in 1954. Those totals provide striking testimony of the power of the communist movement in America and of the conspiracy guiding it and protecting it. Was McCarthy correct in pointing out that subversives had wormed their way into government service? A full year prior to the Senate condemnation of McCarthy, Indiana Senator William Jenner's Senate Internal Security Subcommittee issued its report entitled Interlocking Subversion in Government Departments. It detailed the existence of 4 separate espionage rings operating within our government, along with the fact that only 2 had ever been fully exposed. The remaining 2 have never been exposed. The Jenner-led subcommittee described the Soviet penetration it had uncovered as a, quote, conspiracy, end quote. Yes, there were communists working in our government, but those who could have done something about it didn't seek to remove the communists. They went after McCarthy. With the opening up of the files of the former Soviet Union, numerous researchers have concluded that Joseph McCarthy wasn't wrong at all. As shown in this article from the December 17, 1990 issue of the Los Angeles Times, London-based Professor Roger Scruton is one of many who now conclude that McCarthy was right about the Red Menace. A great deal has transpired since the demise of Joe McCarthy. The enemies of America's intelligence gathering institutions saw to it that the various agencies charged with that responsibility have been abolished. Terrorism, however, continues to rise worldwide. The most effective way to protect oneself from terrorism is through intelligence gathering by agencies of the type that have been abolished. But as each new terrorist act kills and maims more Americans, our leaders suggest new laws to control the entire population, but they refuse to restore the agencies that have been abolished. It's perfectly obvious that most Americans take comfort in the belief that no matter what happens, they'll be able to survive, they'll ride out the storm. And there are others who store gold, collect guns and ammunition, stock food supplies, and even build a hideaway in the hills. These people are preparing to lose their freedom. Wouldn't it be a wiser course to work to defeat the conspiracy, to prepare to win? Unless the path down which our nation is being taken is reversed, the defeat these people see looming on the horizon will become a reality. Then, if they spend some of their stored gold, use some of their ammunition, and show evidence of having food supplies, the authorities will be all over them. And to curry favor, even their neighbors will turn them in. Anyone who feels that there is any alternative to reversing the course our nation is on really hasn't thought the matter through. Anyone who is planning to leave an inheritance for his or her children ought to include freedom as a part of it. Several years ago, I told a Cuban American how lucky I was to live in America. He looked at me somewhat angrily and said, "What do you mean you're lucky? I was the lucky one. I had somewhere else to go when my nation was conquered." That's a rather chilling thought. In the Soviet Union, there were some who felt that they were safe because they never spoke out. That proved to be a very foolish assumption. In keeping with conspiratorial practices over many generations, Lenin instructed his secret police, "Do not ask for incriminating evidence to prove that the prisoner opposed the Soviet government either by arms or word. Your first duty is to ask him what class he belongs to. What were his origin, education, and occupation? These questions should decide the fate of the prisoner. This is the meaning and the essence of Red Terror." In America, we see still free people voluntarily building their own iron curtain around themselves. Many are gripped by fear of retribution and fail to speak out and oppose what is being done to our country and ourselves. Don't let anyone do that to you. You're an American. Your nation is being destroyed and led into the New World Order. Help us to stop this treachery. How can the conspiracy's progress be stopped? the solution is majestically simple. In fact, the essence of any brilliant strategy is simplicity. The conspiracy's drive toward totalitarian power can be stopped if enough people know about it, speak out about it, and demand a return to age-old principles. 25 years ago, a group of criminals who happened to be American Indians cooked up a plan to take control of a section of land within our borders, declare themselves an independent nation, import arms from communist governments with whom they were already in contact, and wage war on the United States from within. Funding for their designs had been provided through a cleverly concocted scheme involving an agency of the U.S. government. These subversives had already intimidated large numbers of fellow Indians. Virtually overnight, they boasted that they spoke for all of the American Indian population. In a matter of just a few weeks, however, wide distribution of these two articles, prepared under the auspices of the John Birch Society, sufficiently exposed the plot, and the American Indian movement was repudiated. A few years later, the Equal Rights Amendment was sailing toward complete ratification when the John Birch Society recognized it for what it truly was. As written, this amendment would have given the federal government new authority to control any activity engaged in by men or women. That's everything. Our people went to work and persuaded state legislators to reject ratification, and that threat of dramatically enlarged federal power passed. More recently, plans to subject the Constitution to wholesale change through a constitutional convention or a conference of the states were thwarted when our people distributed the truth about the intent of the would-be destroyers. The John Birch Society's trim committees have distributed tens of millions of these report cards on the members of the House of Representatives. Voters who receive them learn, sometimes for the first time, what their representative has been doing instead of what he is saying. In many districts, the voters have then chosen someone else to represent them in the halls of Congress. In some districts, congressmen have decided to alter their habits and vote for less government and lower taxation. Is the conspiracy invincible? Of course not. It operates largely on bluff, and it's time to call the bluff. Can it be defeated? Indeed it can. And the road to victory is through organized education, exposure, and courageously standing for principle. If we look around, we have to admit that some hidden force has a tight grip on government, the press, religion, education, even the military. Taxes and controls continue to grow. Our children can't offer a prayer in the increasingly deficient and dangerous schools we are forced to finance. Many of the churches we were brought up in are unrecognizable today. And the mass media we are told to trust give us pap and misinformation for news and a steady diet of smut and terror for entertainment. We are told that doing business with the worst murderers in all history, the Communist Chinese government, is a good idea, even while they continue to murder and tyrannize their own people. We are told that a still professing socialist named Gorbachev is some new Democrat, and we wonder as he is invited to speak in the halls of Congress. We are told that our armed forces must police the world for the United Nations. We remember that those who warned about tolerating abortion also warned that allowing it would lead to the killing of the old and the infirm. Will the politically incorrect be next? We must not let all of this continue, for if we do, we shall soon live in tyranny. Few Americans today know the name Dr. Joseph Warren. A Boston physician, he was a leading patriot at the beginning of our nation's struggle for independence. On March 6, 1775, he spoke at the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre when British troops had fired into a crowd of civilians and killed several of them. Warren knew that a British guard was on its way to arrest him. He spoke over the heads and fixed bayonets of British redcoats who were standing right before him. But he proceeded to implore his fellow Americans to resist tyranny and fight for freedom. Here is some of what he said in 1775, words that certainly need to be heard today. Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are powerful and numerous, but we have many friends determining to be free, and heaven and earth will aid the resolution. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves. The faltering tongue of hoary age calls on you to support your country. The lisping infant raises its suppliant hands, imploring defense against the monster slavery. Your fathers look from their celestial seats with smiling approbation on their sons who boldly stand forth in the cause of virtue, but sternly frown upon the human miscreant who, to secure the loaves and fishes to himself, would breed a serpent to destroy his children. Dr. Joseph Warren fell mortally wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. He didn't live long enough to see his countrymen succeed in the war for independence from Great Britain. We owe something to Dr. Joseph Warren and to all who helped to create this wonderful nation. Also, as he said, we owe something to the lisping infants who are counting on us to leave to them history's greatest experiment in human liberty, the free and independent United States of America. I know you won't idly stand by and let a foul conspiracy destroy it. Therefore, we invite you to come and join us in the John Birch Society and be part of our proud companionship in our epic undertaking.